If you're a fan of drag racing history, or even just racing history in general, chances are that you've seen this car in your social media while scrolling. At some points, it looks fake. An Allison V12 powered Slingshot Dragster? Weren't Allisons typically mounted in the back of the cars that ran them in the 50s and 60s? Wait, does one of them also have a turbonique rocket booster in the back of it? The answers to all these questions and more will be given in this video as we look at not only Lee Pendleton's Spitfire I and II Allison Slingshots, but at some other interesting creations, including the one that likely inspired Pendleton to attack the strip in this manner at all. While aircraft engine drag racing cars existed in all corners and on all coasts of the United States back in the 1950s and 60s, Ohio certainly served as the epicenter of the world for the military surplus crowd. Of course, we all know why. The Arfons brothers. I've covered their exploits in great detail on this channel, so we really don't need to have that lesson again, but safe it to say, Lee Pendleton, who is the lead player in this story, was largely influenced by the half-brothers from Akron. So weren't the likes of the Stoll brothers, George and Don of Swanton, Ohio. In fact, the swirl of ideas between these three family names would lead to the creation of Spitfire I. But we have to head back in time before we get to all of that. Lee Pendleton was a smart man. A mechanical engineer, a truly gifted mechanic, he was the type of guy who could visualize and build anything, even things of great complexity as his life accomplishments would later bear out. He was also the best kind of mechanical engineer, the kind who was obsessed with drag racing, hot rodding, and horsepower. While there is little record of Lee Pendleton in drag racing before the year of 1957, I'm reasonably certain that this guy attended and likely competed frequently in the Ohio area. He likely spent time at strips around the central U.S. as a racer, wrench, and fan. Maybe it was gas coupes, maybe it was something else, but as bland and as blind as this idea sounds as complete conjecture, it really can't be. In 1957, Lee Pendleton bought Green Monster No. 5 from the Arfons boys, and that's not something a newbie off the street simply does. No, that's something for someone who wanted to go really fast for the era, and someone who understood the value of crowds running to the fence to see a particular machine. Lee Pendleton didn't just buy a car, he bought a nationally known legend, and more importantly, and specifically, he bought a business. The Green Monster 5 had debuted in 1955 and first used a Ranger V12 airplane engine, which was cool but a comparative toy to the Allison V1710 that would make it nationally known. It's important to see this car in the context of drag racing in the middle 1950s. Despite the fact that it had a massive engine in it, it was still considered just a gas dragster. It was classified along with the other gas dragsters running their little, relatively speaking, V8 engines. The AHRA and NHRA allowed such engines in competition, and while it may seem an insane advantage to run a 1,710 cubic inch engine against guys with 354 or 392 or less, it really wasn't. And there was a simple reason for this: chassis and tire technology. The big engine made so much power it had to be walked off the starting line like a school bus and then fed power gradually. While Green Monster No. 5 ran incredible mile per hour for its day, it was never capable of making the elapsed times it would need against the far lighter and less powerful V8 dragsters to win anything. But boy, did people love it. Outside of the size and the sound and the craziness of it, you really need to remember that in the 1950s, the country was about a decade off the end of World War II, and these mighty engines, still being sold in crates for less than $100 at surplus yards, were mechanical heroes. It wasn't just the audacity of the car with the engine, it was the fact that many drag racers were ex-military mechanics that had worked on them, maybe pilots that had flown them, or maybe even GIs that had been saved in raids from above through their roar and diving attacks against the enemy. The Allison V12 was quite literally the sound and muscle of freedom for many fans of the burgeoning sport of drag racing. Lee Pendleton got the car and began running it. He also began tweaking on it. He added the dual slicks at the back, as well as adding some ducting on the body to help feed the inadequate and overheating brakes some air. It all worked swimmingly, until it didn't. Lee Pendleton crashed the car. Now, thankfully, it was a relatively light crash and only damaged the nose cone and kind of produced a car with a little less flare on the body side after he fixed it, but far more on the functionality side. It became less the Green Monster and more the Lee Pendleton Special. The more snub-nosed, finless look was the one that Lee Pendleton used during the majority of his time with this former Green Monster 5. He ran the big AHRA and NHRA meets of the day, large independent events, and match races all over creation. It's impossible to say if he won a lot, but he was making money with the car, so that in and of itself was a winning strategy. At some point, whether it was during the Nationals in 1957 or perhaps likely around the same state of Ohio that they shared, Lee Pendleton saw the Allison-powered creation of George and Don Stahl of Swanton, Ohio, known as the Brandis Motor Sales Special. This was an Allison-powered Slingshot Dragster. This thing was an engineering marvel that drag racing has largely forgotten about, but we're about to give this baby its due. The car was seemingly unique among the aircraft engine-powered cars of the 50s in the fact that the brothers decided to put the engine in the front of the machine. Every Arfons car, as well as other random-powered creations with aircraft engines, had always stuffed the huge Allisons or Rangers in the back. Why? Well, it was for starters getting weight over the rear tires to get some traction because there was none, and then there was the power transfer. How do you get an airplane engine designed to spin a propeller to work an axle? As it turned out, there were a couple of methods in use, but the Stoll boys were the next level of creative in their approach. Their car, built entirely of square tubing in the late 50s, went through a couple of iterations to solve the power transfer issue. The first version, which we can see in the images captured here at the 1958 NHRA Nationals, show us that the brothers had elected to place the engine in the same way it would have been seated in a fighter plane. The carburetor's up near toward the firewall, and the output end of the engine is actually facing toward the front axle. Now, of course, in an airplane, you would want it this way because instead of having to drive a rare set of tires, you would be spinning a propeller, so you'd want the crankshaft facing toward the front of the aircraft. Now, these guys had actually kept the long, bullet-shaped propeller reduction gear drive, and this is where things get really, really good. By all appearances, they created a chain drive that went to an offset bell housing and clutch, which was bolted to an automotive transmission. Now, that transmission sent a drive shaft down the side of the engine to an offset ring and pinion gear in the rear axle, and supposedly this thing could run dang near 150 miles per hour with this harebrained-looking setup. Now, let's call this version 1 of the Brandis Motor Sales Special. By the time the 1959 Nationals came around, the fellows had enhanced the complexity, weight, and the strength of their system with an entirely new setup. Now, they had also upped the performance something fierce, as the car was now capable of making near 170 mile per hour runs, and it was being advertised as a match racing commodity. Best I can tell, as you're going to look at this car, it went about 168 miles an hour at its best. So what did they do? For starters, they ditched the large, heavy, and conical-shaped propeller drive that had previously been on the end of the engine and converted the business end of the Allison to an Allison E-Series output. Now, we're going to talk about those E-Series engines in a few minutes, but this was an important change. They also added a massive industrial multi-disc clutch that received a stubby drive shaft from the engine, sent the output through another stubby drive shaft into a humongous V-drive setup. In turn, this sent the power backward to the axle and sent the car down the drag strip. The layout is really and truly cool, and while this car didn't garner major wins anywhere or set records in any sort of nationally known way, this particular drive arrangement, both in the first and second versions, are mind-bogglingly awesome in my eyes, and I have never seen another car, in all of my drag racing research and reading, use anything near this to actually work in any sort of functional fashion. Now, if you're wondering why they didn't simply spin the whole engine around and just send the power backward like a normal setup after removing the propeller drive, I have to believe it's because they would have had to basically build a brand new car. To make room for their clutch and all the other stuff, the engine would have had to have been drastically moved forward, and then the rear axle would have had to have been reconfigured. The drive shaft would have basically run through the cockpit, and offsetting the engine ahead of what looks to be the better part of 2 feet would have been really harmful to whatever tiny semblance of traction the car had at that point. so I can kind of understand working around the obvious problem of having the output of the engine facing in the wrong direction versus re-engineering the entire outfit to simply turn the engine around. So as previously mentioned, whether it was the Arfons boys or anyone else running Allison stuff, typically the engines lived behind the drivers. Now, if you look closely at the Arfons cars over the years, they had another thing in common. The Arfons cars never had that big, 1.5 to 2 foot long conical propeller drive hanging off the back of their engines like the Stoll brothers did at first. Why? What did these guys know? Well, as it turns out, they knew Allisons. There were an incredible array of Allison engines produced during the 20 years it was the highest volume, liquid-cooled, V-style military aircraft engine America's military had. There were series and sub-series and experimental versions and on and on. One specific series of engines was favored by racers and hot rodders looking to install them into drag racing machines, racing boats, land speed cars, and other stuff. Those were the V1710-E. What made this specific version of the Allison engine so attractive to the users was not the power output or the internals, it was how it was designed to be used. The E-Series was effectively a remote mount application of the Allison V12. Instead of the propeller drive being bolted to the back of the engine directly, the engine was equipped with a flange that was intended to spin a drive shaft. Now, the first major application of this E-Series engine was in one of the most unique and perhaps misunderstood aircraft of World War II, the Bell P-39 Air Cobra. The P-39 was an incredibly unique design for its day because its engine was mounted behind the cockpit of the aircraft, used a near 10-foot-long drive shaft to spin a gear set at the nose of the plane that turned the propeller. Now, that drive shaft happened to be in the open, passing directly between the pilot's legs. No covering, no shield, just whipping around right there. Yowza. Now, whirling parts aside, this setup allowed the plane to be pretty nimble. It also allowed a 37mm cannon to be mounted straight through the center of the propeller hub. Now, this plane originally was intended to have a turbocharger on the engine for high-speed, high-altitude work. Unfortunately, the aerodynamic costs of the turbo and the associated ducting, plumbing, and weight caused it to be dropped. Now, this in turn really neutered the plane's ability to perform at altitude, and it reduced the top speed far below what was originally envisioned. But, bristling with weaponry like the aforementioned 37mm cannon in the nose and multiple 50 caliber machine guns, the P-39 had unintentionally become a really good ground attack and close air support aircraft. After being largely pushed aside by the Allies, the Russians hungrily accepted the P-39 and used the planes with fantastic results. They turned the machine into the single most important piece of equipment they had on the Eastern Front and used them extensively during campaigns like their insanely huge Bagration operation that drove the Germans all the way back to their own borders and way deeper than that. Because of how many missions they flew and how much action they saw, the seemingly underappreciated P-39 actually holds the record for the highest number of aircraft victories attributed to any American-built fighter plane to this day, and I am making this in 2025. At low altitudes, the P-39 could get the job done, and that nose-mounted cannon could literally shred other aircraft almost instantly. Roughly 10,000 of these planes were built during the war, with many thousands going to the Russians. Allison produced 18,998 E-Series engines total. Bell produced another variant of the plane known as the P-63, which did use the engine, but the production of that aircraft was pretty small at only 3,300 made. Now, this means that there were thousands of these E-Series engines alone just kind of sitting there in crates, making their way to salvage yards, surplus yards, and ultimately into the hands of hot rodders. So to review, the E-Series was a more compact, manageable unit to put in some kind of a race car. The engine came in at about 1,200 pounds, so a couple of 100 pounds, generally speaking, lighter than a fully dressed prop drive equipped version of the engine. Having the ability to use a drive shaft was a great advantage beyond having to muster some sort of contraption like the Stoll brothers did to make their car initially work. While we're here, let's talk power. There were 21 variants of the E-Series Allison made. Now, of these different production models, the most popular version was called the E4, rated at 1,490 horsepower at war emergency levels. The E11, rated at 1,810 horsepower at war emergency level, and the highest volume of all was the E19, rated at 1,410 horsepower at war emergency. And the E21, rated at 1,800 horsepower, had several thousand made, and it was the most powerful of the, let's call them, normal versions of this engine. Now, the variation in power rating comes from the usage or non-usage of an auxiliary second-stage supercharger on the engines themselves. None of the guys in the video used an additional supercharger in their drag racing cars, but they would sometimes change the gear ratios of the single-stage supercharger that was on the engine, depending on the conditions and how much power they were looking to make. Another thing to remember is the fact that these horsepower ratings are at an altitude of like 15,000 feet and made at 3,000 RPM. World War II aircraft were never allowed to run at full throttle on the ground or even at basic sea level. The only time they ever saw wide open throttle was way up in the air. At ground level, running the planes at full throttle for any length of time would cause massive detonation issues and kill engines very quickly. So what does this actually mean? What it means is that when guys like Arfons and Pendleton were spinning these things at the better part of 4,700 to 5,000 RPM on the ground, they were making way more power than the rated horsepower they made in the Wild Blue yonder. How much? Some say 2,500, some say more than that, but they were sending these cars through the lights at 170 plus miles an hour, basically idling off the starting line on junk tires with no traction on any part of the strip. Of course, this was okay for the engines to do for a handful of seconds at a time with a relative light load on them as they hazed the tires through the lights and moved a machine that weighed about 3,000 pounds or less to the end of a drag strip. In the air, ripping a propeller through the atmosphere and working hard at wide open throttle to treetop levels was a guaranteed ticket to engine destruction. Now, it is important to remind you that in the late 50s, these engines could be had in their crates for less than $100 a piece, brand new. Stunning cheapness aside, there was also the work of getting this power from the engine to an axle. Now, there was not an automotive-type clutch in the world designed to handle this type of horsepower, so when the Arfons boys built Green Monster No. 5, the car that Pendleton bought in 1957, they decided on a unique, beefy, and very heavy solution. These guys used an 11-disc oil bath Hall-Scott tugboat clutch, which weighed 460 pounds by itself. No kidding. When you look at Green Monster 5 or Lee Pendleton's version of it, you will see a round bullet-shaped canister at the back of the car, and that is where the clutch lives. It takes the power from the drive shaft and sends it back to the axle, which was a custom-built banjo-style unit made with truck parts and flipped backwards to accept the drive shaft out of the rear-mounted clutch. Amazingly, as time went on, their brothers developed a rudimentary electronic lockup system on Green Monster 6. Now, I believe Green Monster 5 was a strictly pedal-controlled unit, which kind of makes some evolutionary sense. After running the car for the 1958 and majority of the 1959 season with the Howard's Camp special name on the nose and traveling extensively, Lee Pendleton had been dreaming of the next iteration of an Allison-powered dragster. Taking everything he had learned in running the current car he had, watching what others had done, and knowing that there was a better way forward, he and his wife Carol decided to take the leap. After all, at 2,950 pounds, the thing was simply too heavy, the layout was not really able to be evolved, and the lapse times in the 10s at 169 were fun, but there was a lot more to be had out there with cheap Allison power. Late in the 1959 season, Pendleton sold his car to a man from Arizona named Charlie Hall. The former Green Monster went away, and the path to the car that would be known as Spitfire was born. That car would be a showcase for the talent and brilliance of Lee Pendleton. For the 18 months following the sale of his previous car, he and Carol welded, wrenched, chopped, and schemed on the new car. The end result was a slingshot dragster the likes of the world had never seen. Unlike the other Allison cars, this thing was sleek, it wasn't ungainly, and it actually looked racy. The dragster had a wheelbase of 128 inches, had 73% of its total weight on the rear axle, and weighed 2,400 pounds. That was still pretty porky compared to other normal V8-powered cars, but it was about a quarter ton lighter than the last version he had. Then there were the wings. Pendleton decided that he needed additional downforce to try and aid the seemingly helpless task of planning the tires going down the strip. He went to a scrapyard and cut the ailerons off a large surplus military plane, cutting those down to 4 feet, and he made mounts to mount them on the side of the body so there were 4-foot wings on either side and they could be moved and mounted quickly. With about 10 square feet of area, having an angle of attack of about 10 degrees, Pendleton figured that they would make about 600 pounds of downforce at 180 miles per hour. It was an educated guess at the time, and frankly, I don't know enough about air or aerodynamics to counter-argue it. Do you? It's not a challenge. If you know more, just tell us in the comments. Very early runs without the wings netted speeds of about 175 miles per hour. He added the wings quickly, and the car picked up 10 miles per hour instantly. It was running 185 in early testing. The chassis Pendleton made was constructed of mild steel, used 2.5-inch outside diameter tubing of 115 thousandths wall thickness for the main rails. The cowl hoop and the roll bar were 1.75 inches outside diameter, and they were 1/8 of an inch of wall thickness. Now, the car used a drop-forward front axle and huge, for the time, and I say huge in quotes, 10-inch wide M&H Racemaster slicks on 10-inch wide wheels, and the car did not have any rear suspension. Pendleton's mechanical, machine, and hot rodding genius really starts to shine through when we get to the drivetrain, especially the clutch. As you have noticed, the engine is sitting in the normal orientation for a Slingshot. Carburetors up front, driveshaft coming out the back. Unlike the Stoll brothers, there's nothing hanging out the back like the Arfons creations, and so the big question is, where's the clutch? And the answer is right behind the engine. Lee Pendleton had designed it and built it himself, and it's an actual interesting piece of drag racing history. Lee Pendleton Spitfire is the first 4-disc clutch-equipped dragster in the history of the sport. And yes, I know, I did say that the Arfons guys had an 11-disc clutch, but it was a tugboat clutch, and I don't count that in the same league as Pendleton because it was a tugboat clutch. And Pendleton was a dragster clutch designed by him, built by him, using car parts. The homemade creation used 4 Velvet Touch 10-inch diameter clutch discs normally used in heavy-duty trucks. Now, the clutch was really interesting because it was fully pedal-controlled, but also had a kind of semi-centrifugal engagement element as well. The clutch is described as having what sounds like floaters, separated by short links that used ball-style ends, which received sockets on the clutch plates. As the clutch was spun up, the discs would pull in on these links and clamp down. Now, as Popular Hot Rodding magazine says, quote, "The secret is a comparatively small torque on one of the plates which gives tremendous leverage to move the other plate in or out. The principle is used to apply the clutch pressure plate. There are no conventional coil springs around the plate, and all force is being applied with a relatively light spring located in the cockpit that acts directly on the clutch arm." End quote. Pendleton used a very long pedal, creating lots of mechanical advantage, and he could control the slip perfectly off the starting line to launch the car by using his foot, and when things were hooked up and rolling, he could let the pedal all the way out and allow his mechanical design go to work. The rear axle was also completely scratch-made by Lee Pendleton. Working in the tool and die industry, being an engineer, and understanding so many aspects of metalworking, he made himself exactly what he needed, effectively, from thin air. Using 14-gauge steel plates, he made the center section. He used parts, which I assume were bearings and stuff, from a white truck rear end and then ran into a problem with gears. He needed a 2-to-1 ratio. Like literally instead of a 410, he wanted 2-to-1 in the rear axle of this thing, or somewhere thereabouts. He couldn't find any until he got Gleason Gearworks to make him a set for $300, which was custom. It had a 6-inch ring gear and was pretty beefy for the time. Now, the final ratio was either, if you read some places, 1.96 to 1, other places say 2 to 1, but either way, this thing had some long legs. Interestingly, by the time this car was profiled in a 1962 issue of Popular Hot Rodding magazine, people were already lamenting the shocking rise in price of Allison V12 engines. I mentioned that the $50 to $100 range for new ones in the 50s was common, but now 17 years after the war, a few things had happened. Not only racers, but industrial uses had started to snatch up many of the engines from the stockpiles. Most shocking of all, And the biggest spike in market price came when the Dow Chemical Company bought 2,000 of these things in one shot to power massive water pumps at their magnesium mining and processing stations on the Gulf Coast of America. That happened in 1959, and the price skyrocketed, never to drop back down again. Now, this said, it was still pretty much cheaper to bite the bullet and do one of these engines in the long run than a nitro-burning engine that would need to be fixed or replaced completely with some regularity in a dragster. Pendleton's engine setup was basic. It was an E-Series V12 like we talked about previously. He also used the 9.6-to-1 so-called high-altitude supercharger drive gears. This allowed the car to produce somewhere around 30 to 40 psi of boost at ground level. Amazingly, if he had run the slower 8.1-to-1 ratio, he likely would have seen more boost with the lower tip speeds of the centrifugal blower, meaning it would be far more efficient. But Pendleton favored the 9.6 ratio because he felt it gave him more mid-range torque and power when he was trying to make the runs, and while the 8.1 ratio may have given more speed, he was happy with the combo he had and had sorted out. Amazingly, when the popular hot rodding story came out, the car was on its way to 190 miles per hour. The math said that using the tire size with a 2-to-1 gear ratio at 180 miles per hour, the engine should be turning 3,950 RPM with full traction. Well, he never had that, so as he smoked the tires the entire way down the racetrack, Pendleton said his tach was normally reading 4,400 to 4,700 RPM in the lights. Allison engineers during the war would have hated this guy. So there was one small detail that I have failed to mention. Since we've gotten all the way to 1962, I probably should have brought this up earlier, but after the 1959 NHRA Nationals, Wally Parks banned aircraft engines from NHRA National Meet competition. It was going to be automotive engines only from that point forward. And as Parks writes in his own book, Drag Racing Yesterday and Today, quote, "The aircraft power plants didn't suit the basic appeal of organized drag racing. There were other ways of getting the cubic inches that produced the power," end quote. In a growing effort to court Detroit automakers, airplane-powered cars winning trophies didn't really help the cause. So why did Lee Pendleton proceed with a car that NHRA wouldn't let him race? Easy answer. Because the AHRA would. Jim Tice's AHRA was the more rebellious and rowdy of the sport's major sanctioning bodies in this period. If you could dream it up, Tice would find a class for you, especially if the car was entertaining to watch, and this thing was. Pendleton and his wife Carol traveled the nation with Spitfire, racing against some of the biggest names in the sport, both in organized competition, match races, and simple booked-in exhibitions. An encounter with another drag racing genius would inspire one simple change to Spitfire for 1963. Sneaky Pete Robinson showed Lee Pendleton the jacking system he used on his car to spin the tires up to speed and then drop on the ground when the flagman moved. Pendleton knew he needed those things too. For the 1963 season, the car he ran used launching jacks. Now even this brought Pendleton into the debate between Robinson and Don Garlitz, which surrounded the safety and legality of the jacks. Lee Pendleton actually stepped up and wrote a letter to Drag News defending the jacks and their usefulness, which I've been showing you here as I've explained this situation. It's kind of wild to see him quoted and what he's saying. Pendleton was strongly in favor of their use and certainly used a lot of his logic as an engineer to defend their usage, but as we all know, they were banned eventually. A successful racer with a nationally known car and the sky seeming to be the limit, Lee Pendleton made two major moves in 1963. He opened the Penco Machine Company in Ashtabula, Ohio, which was a tool and die shop that did mold making, prototyping work, and eventually would become an OE-level supplier of those things. He also decided to build a new iteration of Spitfire called Spitfire II. Some others called it the Mighty Monster. Continuing to run the first car, Spitfire II needed a driver for the 1964 season when it would debut, and a young man from Ashtabula, Ohio named Howard Wysong was chosen for the work. 26 years old and an experienced racer, he'd be the guy who'd chase speeds over 190 miles per hour and perhaps even upwards of 200 in this new and improved car. The chassis was lighter and stronger, the wings were refined, it was run with dual rear slicks, and over the course of the spring of 1964, it was doing just what Wysong and Pendleton had hoped. Now, a curious addition was made at some point before June of 1964. A turbonique thrust rocket was added to the rear of the Dragster just below the parachute launcher. There's no real way of reporting to whether or not it worked, whether or not they ever used it, or whether it was simply there for show, but the fact that it was there and plumbed into several different tanks certainly means to me that there was intention to use it, if not repeated use of the rocket. Incredibly, and incredibly sadly, Howard Weissong was killed in Spitfire II in June of 1964 at the AHRA Summer Nationals on the grounds of US 30 Drag Strip in Gary, Indiana. As sad and truly traumatic as this dramatic high-speed crash was, little did anyone know what was to come in 1965. It seems that by all account, after the Weissong fatality, Lee Pendleton hung up his drag racing helmet pretty quickly. A kind and respected man, one's heart twists into a knot trying to understand his feelings after this crash. And then in March of 1965, things got exponentially worse. For the first time in the history of the sport and of the sports drag racing media, a photo sequence of a life-taking wreck was not only published as a color center spread in a magazine, it was highlighted on the cover. Editor Phil Engeldrum of Rotting and Restyling ran the Enrico Cappiello photos and explained his reasoning in the editorial column he wrote at the front of the magazine, and the reasons are kind of salacious, kind of confrontational, and certainly kind of a self-justification for doing something that really was not in good taste. Published under the guise of a safety expose, it was a thin story that was clearly crafted to give license to Engeldrum to run the photos. Interestingly, Spitfire II had clearly been shot for a feature before this, and those feature photos were used in the story as well. Outside of some amateur photos and 8mm video captured at races, they are the only detailed images of Spitfire II. The differences in chassis construction can be seen, the new body, the different exhaust, and most wildly, the rocket mounted at the rear. Even crazier is that the rocket and the large bottles of gas and fuel for it just kind of sit in the open right next to the driver's compartment. In the description of the crash, it is said that Weissong veered off the course at the top end, put a wheel into the grass, and that caused the massive high-speed wreck you see here. What caused it will never be known. Driver error, wing failure, the rocket, all academic debates. Pendleton's name all but vanishes from the world of drag racing after the Weissong crash. He clearly concentrated on creating a successful business, which he did at the Penco Tool and Machine Company, and he must have kept himself entertained with car projects on the side, and we have to believe that he lent a hand on some racing stuff, but it was all quiet until the late 1970s. Lee Pendleton had an Act 2. It was Allison-powered, it was turbocharged, and it was perhaps the most off-the-wall pulling tractor ever built. He called it the City Slicker, and it's to this day a machine that has people running to the fences whenever and wherever it's getting hooked to a sled. To describe the City Slicker, one ends up explaining a machine that Willy Wonka himself may have decided to build. A Rolls-Royce grill up front, a Rolls-Royce silver ghost-style cowl that leads to a very low driver position, but the real fun starts next. An Allison V12 with 3 turbochargers sits sideways, spreading its considerable length all the way across the midsection of the tractor. On one end is a clutch, which is attached to a sprocket. A brace of massive roller chains, some 5 wide, travel over that little sprocket to one that measures in multiple feet across, turning 2 monstrous pulling tractor tires mounted on a solid axle so close together they nearly touch. Yes, this is a chain-driven, turbocharged V12 Allison-powered pulling tractor. And the words painted behind the driver's head read, quote, "Stuck in no one's rut," end quote. Lee Pendleton certainly was not in any part of his life or in any part of the design or execution of this machine stuck in anyone's rut. All of his design choices had some reasoning to them. He wanted the machine and center of gravity low for better traction and loading of the tires. He wanted the Allison because he knew him, loved him, and with the turbos he knew he could make as much or more power in the 9,000-pound class than anybody else. The tires being stuffed so close together meant that he'd be able to run on parts of the pulling course that other tractors had not chewed up yet, and using the narrow track width of the Slicker to his advantage, the thing naturally wanted to go straight, and it stood far less of a chance of getting wonky when the front end came up so it wouldn't unload one tire or the other when hooked to the sled. Now, Pendleton once again found himself competing against the likes of Art Arfons, who was pulling with turbine power very successfully. As wild as the City Slicker was, it did work. Results could be found of pulling wins, top-level finishes, and newspaper coverage anticipating its participation in events around the middle of the country. The City Slicker tractor still exists and goes to work with a pulling sled behind it today in legend and historic style pulling series, and it is a fan favorite wherever it shows up. People just flock to it. Every element of the thing is unique, touched by Pendleton, and has stood the test of time, especially that turbocharged Allison. Lee Pendleton passed away at 89 years old in 2024. A brilliant man, a heck of a racer, and a craftsman of exceptional talent, he's one of those drag racing names that too few people know and appreciate. It's sure wild how many guys from Ohio fell in love with and messed around with the Allison V12 engine. I'm sure glad they did, because they continue to fascinate me with the power they made, the power they still make, and how versatile they've turned out to be. The brilliance of Spitfire I, the tragedy of Spitfire II, and the absolutely off-the-wall experimental nature of the City Slicker tell us all we need to know about Lee Pendleton, the racer. The business he started, which continues to operate more than 60 years later after he opened it, has supplied OE equipment to machines like the Dodge Viper and stands as a testament to Lee Pendleton, the engineer, the tool and die maker, and the metalsmith. I sure would have loved to have seen Spitfire I rip a 185-mile-per-hour blast from the top end at a drag strip and then gone over to shake Lee Pendleton's hand. How about you? I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more hot rodding, drag racing, aircraft piston pounding, high-speed history. I'll see you next time.